Hi, Josh.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Why do you smile as you say that, Josh?
Because
because you're doing pretty good, I guess.
Well, it's always I've heard so many of these conversations where it starts out with hi, so-and-so, how are you doing? And it's hard to capture. I always wanted to actually give you the Christopher Hitchens line of it's too early to tell.
I'm trying to think of a reply that says something about Christopher Hitchens, but nothing's coming to mind.
That would be nice.
I'm sure you're right. Nothing nice is coming to mind. I'm sure something mean but funny will eventually come to mind, but nothing at all is coming to mind now. So let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. Rate and review us and so on. You are Josh Summers, well-known yoga and meditation teacher and guru. Maybe not guru, but well-known yoga and meditation teacher. You have been doing with me a series of conversations that you dubbed the Dharma of Bob. I pretended to resist that for a while, but I'm warming up to it. I'm Bob.
That's good. You're Bob. And, the reason I'm slightly allergic or I have an issue with the term guru is there's so many bad actors that run under that name. Mm-hmm. That's one reason. And then the second is that I have a long history. I lived in India for a little while after college. And,
How long?
For about a year. Sort of doing an informal Peace Corps type bit of teaching.
Is that where you were introduced to meditation in a serious way?
No. I actually was interested. The first form of meditation I did was kind of a positive visualization practice that I learned in high school that would just be kind of fancy self-help in a way. And then I did get into yogic meditation when I was in India, but I was just teaching primary school there and did a little bit of yoga study while I was there. Okay. But the guru thing, but the problem is when I was in India with the family that I was living with, I developed a bit of an Indian accent. Whenever someone mentions the guru informally, I often will slip into something which would then get me in deep trouble now. So it
would get you canceled now.
I kind of freeze up when the term guru is mentioned.
By the way, is it the case now that doing any foreign accent is, in some circles at least, cancel worthy, or?
The only one that I might consider doing is the Irish accent.
Why, do you have Irish ancestry, so you're exempt?
I lived there too. I spent a year of university in Ireland, so I feel like I have Irish godchildren. So that exempts me.
Okay. I have actual Irish ancestry, which explains a certain amount, but we needn't get into that. So what should we get into? Well,
where are we in the Dharma of Bob?
Where are we in the Dharma of Bob? Last time we talked about the current status of my meditation practice. If we have time, we can talk a little about that at the end today. I think you had suggested, you had been faithfully and commendably reading the newsletter, Nonzero newsletter, and you noted that in a recent issue, I got into this idea of the explain, excuse, conflation, this idea that some people have that to explain something is to excuse it.
Or justify it.
To justify it, yeah. And you thought, and I do think it's worth talking about that a little, and then we wanted to get into a question raised by a commenter on the newsletter that was actually left under a different post, but referred to our conversations. This is from somebody who's been watching or listening to our conversations. And that's about how you mobilize productive forces on social media. It's one thing to point out how people are being needlessly tribalistic or whatever word you want to use on social media and being destructive when they may or may not realize it. It's another thing to actually inspire enough people to behave differently on social media and make a difference. So I want to respond to that person's challenge to at least think aloud about how you might do that. And then, if we have time, you wanted to get into, myth.
Yeah, I think that's relevant to what you're up to.
Okay, good.
But also the phrase that you kind of threw out as we set this up is the idea of existential psychological threats, and that's what I was sort of getting at with where are we in your Dharma? That you have this view that
right.
at the core of the diagnosis are these existential psychological threats, and so. Say more about that. What do you mean by an existential psychological threat?
So this occurred to me, that I believe this only occurred to me while I was writing the newsletter in which I talked about I called it the explain, excuse, conflation, sheerly for the, I don't know if alliteration is quite the right word, but having two words in a row that begin with EX, but you're right. You could substitute justify for explain. And I was looking at an example. I mean, the context for the newsletter was that this interesting guy whom I've since taped a podcast with and is now in my podcast feed, Agustin Fuentes, an anthropologist at Princeton, had written this piece for Science, a highly esteemed journal, on the 150th anniversary of publication of The Descent of Man. No, it must be the 140th, right? 1881? Anyway, kind of critical of some aspects of Descent of Man and rightly critical of some aspects of Darwin's own belief system. But I did challenge him on one point he made. He said he thought Descent of Man, quote, was offering justification for empire and genocide. And I thought that actually, no, Darwin was describing how the dynamics by which one people conquers another people, even wipes out another people, but I didn't see him embracing it. And I thought that Augustine was slipping too easily from someone's attempt to explain something into accusing them of excusing it or justifying it. Okay? And I realized, there are other contexts in which something kind of like this has long driven me crazy. Like, specifically, if I say, as I have often said, if you look at what some of these terrorists say before they, shoot up an American nightclub or something, or while they're doing it, not infrequently they say they're doing it because America is bombing majority Muslim nations, or America invaded this or that, and you say that by trying to, in the way of trying to explain why they're doing it, possibly to help us develop policies that will be less inclined to foment terrorism. And people accuse you of excusing it or justifying. You're saying, so you're saying they're justified in doing it? And you say, no, I'm not commenting on that at all. I'm just trying to explain it. Now, the thing that was going on in the Darwin case is I think a little different in its underlying logic. But it was another case, I thought, of looking at someone who's explaining something and accusing them of trying to justify it. And I realized I really think this is a serious problem that gets in the way of productive discourse about our foreign policy and a lot of other things, and really gets in the way of having a more peaceful world. And I realized, I have been saying on, as part of the kind of apocalypse aversion project that I'm pursuing in the Nonzero newsletter, I've been saying that a big part of our problem on this planet is the psychology of tribalism. And I've said that consists of largely of cognitive biases, by which I meant confirmation bias, attribution error. But I've come to realize that I also mean some psychological tendencies that aren't classified generally as cognitive biases, but are deeply problematic. And so if you wanted a rubric that encompasses all of them, like this human tendency to think that people are excusing something when they're explaining it, that they're exonerating someone when they're explaining why someone did something bad, or for example, if you want a rubric that encompasses that on the one hand, and cognitive biases per se on the other, as well as another problem, which is the retributive, not just a retributive impulse, but kind of the intuition that retribution is justified. That I think is another problem that we are saddled with. And I think all of these problems have, in some sense, a basis in the genes, in the genetic kind of infrastructure of human nature. And I just realized that, I need a label that encompasses all these things, whether or not they're categorized as cognitive biases per se. And because I do think overcoming them is so critical if we're going to save the planet, it's fair to call them existential psychological threats. This was my big epiphany while writing the Darwin piece in the newsletter.
Yeah. One question I had is, with both, you mentioned a few sort of under the rubric of existential psychological threat. You mentioned the cognitive biases piece, the conflation between explaining and excusing something, and also this retributive impulse to want to exact revenge in a way. And as I'm listening to you, I was trying to figure out, could you imagine there being a kind of root perception or root tendency in the mind that gives rise to those branch expressions? So one thought that occurred is that it might be something like just a tendency to be privy, or just a tendency to too easily accept a single cause explanation or a monocausal explanation. And because the complexity of the situation, to really tease it out, would kind of overload the cognitive system.
Well,
so a tendency towards facile explanations in a way.
I mean, you could. I mean, there is, on the one hand, I would say, there is a human penchant for economical explanation and simple stories, and sometimes we take that too far. Often, probably. But I would also say that in this case, I think, well, go ahead.
I'm just thinking of the example that you use around terrorism and particularly terrorism that involved, Islamic fundamentalist form of that. And the simple narrative is that those actors are just acting based on some buggy doctrine in a religious text that they are adhering to, and that's the only reason why that's occurring.
Well, I mean, as far as kind of monocausal explanations, they could just as easily accuse me of having one, right? If I'm saying like they're mad about American foreign policy, that's like just a one-dimensional explanation, they might say.
Well, that's the only one you're speaking to,
right? Yeah, no, I would say ultimately it's a whole lot more complicated than that. You're right. I would say, and now you have to look at like how they grew up, why they weren't getting social affirmation or whatever they weren't getting through other means. Why were they driven to this extreme form of expression, and on and on. You're right. I would have a complex story to tell, and I think it's true that some of these people would have a more simple kind of essentialist story to tell. Like in some cases, they would literally think they are inhabited by evil. That's it. There's this force called evil. Some of them might even say Islam is evil or whatever, or Islam is inherently violent and they've been infected with whatever. You're right. Some of these people would come up with simple explanations, but I want to explain why I don't think that's all that's going on here. First of all, I come at this from a background of evolutionary psychology, and it is in the nature of evolutionary psychology, certainly mainstream evolutionary psychology, to see the mind as like a kind of an accumulation of kludges almost. I mean, a kludge being, a kind of in computer terminology, I think it's like a solution that works okay for a particular problem, kind of. And in evolutionary psychology, the idea is that the mind consists of a lot of little things that themselves evolved to solve specific adaptive problems. Now, all of them serve the bottom line of natural selection, or did at one point, at least in our history, perhaps when we were in a very different kind of environment, but that bottom line being genetic proliferation. So it has to be the case that anything that is a biological adaptation was, when it earned its way into our lineage, conducive to genetic proliferation, but still, beyond that, the different parts of the mind in this scenario solve different problems. I mean, just to take something anyone can understand, the hunger drive versus the sex drive, those are different things. Hunger drive is about staying alive long enough to reproduce. Sex drive is about reproducing. And if you look at a finer level and ask, well, where does confirmation bias come from? Where does attribution error come from? In other words, what adaptive problem was being solved? And then, if you assume that this tendency to equate the retributive instinct or impulse, another adaptive problem, and then if you get to this tendency to equate explaining why someone did something with excusing them for it, I first of all, it is my intuition, although this is not a well developed part of evolutionary psychology. It's not like some consensus that tendency has a basis in our genes. I do suspect it does, but in any event, the evolutionary psychologist's first impulse is to look at these case by case and ask, what adaptive problem do they solve? Now, I do think they all have something in common. They all are related to the fact that people evolved in a context. We evolved in a context in which people argued with one another about who deserved what, about who had been fair and who hadn't been, about who done the most important part of the hunting and deserved more food, about who had unfairly stolen whose mate, whatever. The premise, the idea that we have a hereditary infrastructure for engaging in moral argument is that our species has been doing it a long time, and who won the arguments has had implications for who got their genes into the next generation most effectively. Okay, so I would say these four things are bound by having originated in that context. I would say that. But beyond that, it gets to be a kind of a complicated story. And
do you want to can you say more about what evolutionary or what adaptive solution one of these biases would have provided, like say confirmation bias?
Yeah, I mean, if you accept the premise that people argued over things, and argued over who owed who what, like, wait, I've done 3 favors for you, and you've only, and so you owe me, like, remember when I did this for you? And so on, or argue about, wait, I've gone out on the last 7 hunts. I've been a real trooper. I brought food back to the whole, the whole community. I deserve some sex or something. I don't know what the argument would be, but
I was going to let you say that.
I deserve more of the food or something. No, I don't think that you would make the argument quite explicitly. I don't think that would be part of the deal, that you would explicitly argue that you deserve sex, but I deserve something. Or you just want to toot your own horn because that impresses people and they are going to treat you with more respect and defer to you and so on, whatever. Then it's obvious that something like confirmation bias, which is just a tendency to, yes, always remember the things I've done for other people, But I don't have to remember the things that they've done for me because it is in my interest to be convinced myself that I've done a disproportionate amount of good stuff so that I can argue that convincingly, right?
I'm having flashbacks to numerous roommates I've had where we've gotten into arguments.
And it was always their fault, right?
I always took out the trash every week. I always emptied the dishwasher.
And they didn't remember that. Imagine that.
Right.
Just your bad luck that you ran into several roommates in a row who didn't have an objective view of reality, whereas you did. So that's an example of now attribution error.
Well, actually, stay with that for a second.
Yeah.
Because I'd like to hear a little bit more about how, a trait or a bias that's adaptive in one environment at one time becomes maladaptive in the current environment. And so because the confirmation bias that was born out of that kind of dynamic you just described, it will lead people to have all sorts of forms of manifestations of cognitive bias in the modern environment that are very different from that kind of early dynamic, right? So how would it like?
So it's like now, it's like, it does and it doesn't. It's true that on the one hand, this impulse was not kind of engineered by natural selection to play out on social media in the context of American politics. This is a radically new environment. On the other hand, if you look at the way people deploy it, like on social media, like the resistance remembers every stupid thing Trump said and no stupid things that whoever their hero has said, or vice versa. The other side does the equivalent. They do deploy that to sometimes elevate their own social status within their group. And you can imagine things having sometimes played out that way in the environment of our evolution. But at the same time,
But don't you think one of the pernicious things about confirmation bias is that it actually filters the data that come into one's perception. So things that create cognitive dissonance get kind of filtered out, and those that kind of affirm one's pre-existing views get selected for.
That's the way it works. You notice and embrace, even uncritically, information that confirms your story. Whether your story is the political ideology you've embraced, the story of your political tribe, or your story that, you do a lot for the world and people should be grateful. Whatever your story, that is confirmation bias, and you are less inclined to notice, less inclined to embrace, more inclined to interrogate critically information that is at odds with your story.
You say more inclined or less inclined?
Well, more inclined to critically evaluate it, right? You're less inclined to embrace it, to notice it, to embrace it. But if you notice it, you're more inclined to go, wait a second, I'd like to see a source for that. I'd like to see, and just pay attention to the way you behave on social media. We all do this. Like, you see somebody report that Trump had his pants on backwards, and it's just like you almost have to restrain yourself from retweeting. It's so appealing. And it turned out he didn't. But if you're a Trump supporter and you see that, you're like, you sure this photo isn't doctored? I want to look into the provenance of this photo, which turned out to be in order, to investigate, because in that case, the story was not true.
They are.
Did you come across that meme, by the way, that Trump was?
No.
If not, you were checked out for a whole day. If you didn't come across the picture that seemed to show that Donald Trump had delivered a whole speech with his pants on backwards, you missed out on an important part of American history. This was really fun.
I have checked out more than I think I've come to realize.
No excuse for that short of being on a retreat, I'll tell you.
I think I'm more on a permanent retreat. But the one thing I had a question of since our last chat was this idea of something being adaptive in the evolutionary context and then being, would you say, maladaptive in the current environment that we live in?
Well, you have to ask what you mean by adaptive. I mean, adaptive in the biological sense just means conducive to genetic proliferation. There are tons of things that are no longer adaptive in that sense because, for example, a lot of people work feverishly for social status, but then don't convert that into reproductive success. They may even have a lot of sex, but use contraception. And so in strict biological terms, that's no longer, quote, adaptive. Now, a separate question is psychologically adaptive. Like, is it psychologically good for you? Even in the environment of our evolution, like if you imagine something like a hunter-gatherer environment, psychologically adaptive and biologically adaptive were not necessarily the same thing. You could be made very unhappy doing things that might get your genes into the next generation.
But to laser in on these existential psychological threats, like particularly the cognitive biases, would you say they were psychologically adaptive or biologically adaptive?
I'd say a lot of them, you move them to a modern environment, and a lot of them are less adaptive in both senses than they may have been in the past.
So this is my question. Is there a word for that?
Well, there is a field called mismatch. Environmental mismatch is a word. I wrote actually a cover story for Time magazine in the 1990s that got me in a little bit of trouble because the Unabomber had just been, I think, caught, or maybe his manifesto had just come out, and it was a screed against technology, and by the way, this is a little bit related maybe to the explain-excuse dichotomy. What I got in trouble for is, in some corners, I just noticed that, a big part of his deal was he just hated what technology had done to the world. And I think he even explicitly said it's not the way we're designed to be. It's not natural, and it's messing us up. And by way of making the point that actually a lot of us feel that way, I started the first sentence in the piece was, there's a little bit of the Unabomber in all of us. And
I can already see the backlash.
That wasn't the worst part. I mean, the worst, anyway, people got the idea, like I quoted him a few times. It was just kind of a journalistic gimmick. He was what was timely, and I used it as a device. And I got it, there's one of his victims who, has said extremely unkind things about me, a well-known computer scientist at Yale who I think had his hand blown off by a Unabomber bomb or something. Anyway, who apparently doesn't like me because of this piece. But I wasn't justifying, I was explaining what motivated him. And I was even saying the perception of the world he had that motivated him was itself an accurate perception. I wasn't saying he was justified in sending people bombs. And this is kind of what I mean. Is like, anyway, you see the point. But anyway, I went on to describe this part of evolutionary psychology called mismatched theory. And an example of that is that, yes, sadness is natural. It served a function in the environmental revolution. Yes, anxiety is natural, but the modern environment lets sadness sometimes fester into unipolar depression. You don't tend to find unipolar depression in actual hunter-gatherer societies. You may find bipolar, which seems to have a genetic basis in some cases for reasons that people can argue about. But unipolar depression that isn't part of a manic depression polarity is really uncommon with people living in something more like the environment we were designed for. And so the theory is that what you see in the modern environment with people get depressed in that sense is, they're sad, and then they're whatever they are. They're living alone, which isn't natural. They're this, they're that. And these unnatural circumstances kind of divert the sadness into depression. And same with anxiety. A little anxiety is natural. But getting to a point where it's just ruling your life is not, and maybe it's features of the modern environment that are doing that. So that's called mismatch theory when you trace certain parts of human unhappiness to a mismatch between our quote natural environment and our current environment. Although again, we weren't designed by evolution to be consistently happy even in a natural environment. We just weren't designed to go crazy. You're right. That would be maladaptive even in the biological sense.
And you use the phrase that living alone was not a natural environment.
Right. Like in isolation, like going to bed every, in a modern environment, you can spend days on end if you want in your own apartment, without talking to anyone.
But you could make the case that that's the way cultural evolution has gone, that it's led to these kinds of design features of material culture so that someone could do that.
Right.
And I would guess that, and I think this is a thread in a lot of things you're describing, that there's a very slow lag between the biological evolution and the technological cultural evolution riding on top of that, right? So,
yeah.
And that's part of the kind of, if you want to call it the evolutionary whiplash, where you have these traits now that are becoming existential threats.
Right. There is that, and then there is, I may have not followed you totally, but one thing there is also is just cultural change, when it changes the environment in a challenging way, we can catch up and adapt. Okay? For example, when urbanization hit in a big way in the late 19th, early 20th century, lots of people moving from farms to cities. That left people it's a weird environment. They weren't used to it. It's not necessarily natural. They no longer had the stabilizing force of family. Novels were written about this, like Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. But institutions did eventually develop. For example, the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, was targeted at these guys who suddenly were at loose ends in a city and could get into trouble and blah, blah, blah. And these Christians wanted to help them not get into trouble. But as technology changes things faster and faster, social media is a good example. It just shows up. And, people about the age of my daughters are just suddenly, it shows up about the time they hit adolescence. And it's a totally bizarre thing. It's totally unnatural, and a concern.
So there's something about the modern environment that within which these old evolutionary traits get planted, that suddenly becomes this pathological / inflamed / socially carcinogenic condition.
Yeah. Because it's not our natural environment, it takes some adjustment. The adjustment may be possible, but it seems like the faster the environment changes, as the pace of technological evolution speeds up, the harder it's going to be to adapt. It takes a while because first of all, you have to develop the social pathology and realize there are people responding to Facebook is unhealthy for say the self-esteem of high school kids or makes them more anxious. You have to see that that's happening and then, set in motion forces to do something about it. Now, maybe that cycle can happen faster than it used to, partly by virtue of technology, but it is a challenge.
Yeah. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I just want to get it out because it keeps coming up and I forget to mention it. When we've talked about social media and the ills of communication on those platforms and their tendency to proliferate tribalistic conflict, one thing that I remember hearing from a woman that I trained in studying acupuncture. She was a Japanese acupuncturist, and she has a really interesting system of acupuncture that is actually taught at Harvard University Med School. But she spoke about how just staring at the size of the small screen, she had an evolutionary argument here, but the staring at the small screen, she felt overactivated the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight aspect of the autonomic nervous system, which would, if that's done chronically, that will put someone into a more reactive tendency, or, have a baseline default sort of inner chemistry of reactivity because of that chronic stimulation. Whereas she would say that we evolved, and I think you might agree, that we evolved to survey vast horizons over the plain. And when there was a small thing that we had to focus in on, that's what activated the sympathetic nervous system of the autonomic nervous system. So it's just this chronic staring even at small things, and then you put in everything else we've talked about in terms of the content on that small screen, which is also inflammatory. It's sort of like stacked on the neurobiology and then the cognitive biases that you're talking about. That you get this kind of layered house of cards or a big problem.
Yeah, and we don't really. I mean, I don't know about that particular idea, but that's the point. The environment, our environment is changing in so many ways that we don't understand the consequences of, and some of them become apparent. Like, one thing the pandemic has done is make people aware of some of the dynamics of a meeting that aren't captured on a Zoom meeting, right? Like making eye contact with someone to silently convey your reaction to something someone else is saying, for example. There's just all these things that don't happen.
Another friend said that they were part of some seminar where they were talking about the excessive stress that Zoom meetings were causing because of the need to constantly look and monitor at people's eyes. Yeah. And that was kind of a something that would trigger or signal threat. Having to look at someone's eyes.
So, anyway, the mismatch theory is the term for this phenomenon where human psychopathologies in particular, or just extreme forms of unhappiness, are a product of differences between the environment we're living in and the environment natural selection engineered us for, and we have not yet come up with a satisfactory adjustment to the tension created. And there's all kinds of adjustments. Meditation is an adjustment. Pharmaceuticals are SSRIs are an adjustment. But it's a scramble. So anyway, so we got here via existential psychological threats. Is that true somehow?
Yes. Yeah. And we were starting out with we could probably come back to the explain, excuse conflation, because this is a pernicious example of it, right?
Yeah. It just happens all the, the flip side of these existential psychological threats is to some extent, you should also list like strengths we want to cultivate, right? This is a very positive psychology kind of idea, and positive psychology has gotten criticized for some things, I'm sure in some cases justifiably, but there is, one thing it has the idea that it's important to build strengths, to see yourself as building strengths as it is to see yourself as solving, addressing your deficiencies, it's just kind of think positive. You're building these strengths that help you address the deficiencies. And I would say cognitive empathy is a strength that needs to be built. Cognitive empathy being the ability to look at things from the perspective of other people. And one thing the explain, excuse conflation does is undermine cognitive empathy. Because if you say, well, I think the way this terrorist is looking at the world is, or I think the reason Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine is, I just think the end of those sentences is inherently worth trying to flesh out. I just think understanding why people do things you don't like is a good idea. But when you start sentences like that and try to exercise the cognitive empathy, you are going to get accused, by people who don't want to hear the answer of trying to justify their behavior, which you're not necessarily trying to do. And so, in my ultimate kind of Dharma Bob textbook or whatever, I guess I would have, there would be this thing about the cultivation of strengths that in a loose way corresponds, not in a one-to-one basis, but bears some relationship to the list of existential psychological threats.
And I assume in the list of strengths, there would be some way to better navigate the dynamic when you find yourself in the crosshairs of being accused of justifying when you're trying to explain. Because one of the things you pointed out is that this tendency in our culture for this to occur is it will inhibit people making good faith efforts to understand the complexity of the situation because they could get shouted down for being a fascist or whatever.
Yeah, I'd work on the problem at both ends. On the one hand, if you are trying to explain why people who did bad things did them, it can help kind of soften up your audience a little to start out by denouncing the people. It's like Bashar Assad is a brutal dictator, but I still think it's useful to understand why whatever he did. That can be an effective rhetorical strategy. I think if you carry it too far, you're kind of reinforcing the overall kind of superstructure that is oppressing you in a sense. In other words, in an ideal world, you just shouldn't have to denounce everyone whose behavior you want to explain. I don't know. It's like, anyway, to work at the problem on the other end, I think, I was talking about this on a podcast the other day. It was the 80,000 Hours podcast, and the conversation is on my podcast feed too. But I was saying we need to stigmatize phrases like apologist. Like one way the explain, excuse, conflation, brings its force to bear on you is for people to say, oh, you're a Putin apologist. You're an Assad apologist. And that just shouldn't be considered cool. It should be considered uncool.
Or you're a white supremacist, or you're...
Well, that's a little different from, there are white supremacists. And
Sure.
Look, there are Putin apologists, but what I mean is, what you're saying, you're talking about ad hominem attacks in general. Yeah. And I'm not getting quite that broad yet. I'm saying the specific term apologist because it is so often leveled in an attempt to shut down cognitive empathy, in an attempt to stop people from explaining why people did things, that it should just be considered uncool because it almost always is. It usually is a way of evading honest assessment. It's a sign that you fear, honest assessment. And we should treat it as such. It should just be like, this actually in a way is a segue to that question, that we had said we might address, about how you mobilize people to solve problems on social media.
And maybe just before we go there though, because something I've been trying to think through is that with the person that's levying the apologist charge, so the person that's calling you an apologist for trying to explain something, I think you might say that the primary biases that are kind of shaping their view that you're just an apologist are both attributionary and confirmation bias. So far, so good?
Well,
there could be others too, but those
I actually think the specific explain, excuse, conflation, it has a more complicated kind of evolutionary origin. That's my suspicion. I don't think we want to get off on this because it's not at all well fleshed out in the literature. My own ideas are kind of inchoate, but I would I would say it has a kind of relationship to both of those things. But it's not like it just consists of them something or something. In a way, it's to some extent kind of sui generis. But anyway.
Okay. Would you say, though, that the person who's charging you with being an apologist they're not aware of the conflation that the conflation hole that they're in? They're not aware that they're conflating explanation and excuse or justification.
I think often there's not awareness that that's the move being made, right? It's just, right. That's why I think it's kind of in the genes. It is such a subtle but strong intuition we have that when someone, and I think we all have it, we all can feel it, that when someone starts explaining why someone did something considered bad, that they aim to excuse it. I mean, it usually is the fact. Right. First of all, that's what they're doing. I mean, in common conversation, usually it's the defenders of people, the friends of people, the allies of people who come up with the reasons. And see, this takes us to attribution error right away, right? Like, that's what attribution error says. That when somebody does something bad, it's their friends who will be able to come up with circumstantial reasons they did it. Reasons other than, oh, it's a bad person. Whereas their enemies will be blind to circumstantial reasons and just want to say, oh, that person's bad. And they don't want to hear these explanations. But I think the reason they don't want to hear them is in part because there is this intuition, that to be able to come up with plausible circumstantial explanations is to exonerate someone.
Right. And I think we've tiptoed around this in the past, that when we talked about mindfulness of feelings, for example, like it's the reason why I think you describe that as difficult is because that intuitive sense is so strongly rooted that we tend to look right past it and not even notice or perceive the intuition or the intuitive impulse. So if someone's calling you an apologist, they're not aware that they're responding to this intuitive sense. It's just, they see it as fact.
Right. They're not aware that there's a logical leap being made.
Right. And so the question that I would ask, and want you to try to think through or explore, is how, if you're in dialogue with someone like that, how do you diplomatically point out the error or the logical leap or the kind of the blind spot at play? Because I think that's what's going on, and this whole issue of cognitive bias is like they are sort of perceptual blind spots that they shape the way we see, so we don't even question the way we're seeing. Well,
I always start when that happens with, "Listen, asshole." No, I don't. That doesn't work. I don't. The only two approaches I know are to. And increasingly I do, this first one is to preface the thing with, look, I'm just trying to get clear. Sometimes it's a matter of just clarifying what exactly is happening. Even that will get you in trouble. Like I had a guest on who was talking about what's happening to the Uyghurs. And you really should clarify up front that there's definitely horrible stuff happening. Their human rights are being violated, but you still think it's worth finding out whether something worthy of the term genocide is happening. And so this was a guy who knew a certain amount about the question of whether, women, in what sense women were being coercively sterilized and so on. So we talked about that. You have to preface that with, it's just good practice to preface that with what is the truth, which is that you're not saying horrible things aren't happening and so on. Now, and I would say the same thing applies when you're explaining. Well, there were other parts of that conversation where he was explaining like why the government is doing this. Okay. What fears led the government to be repressive in the various ways they're being repressive toward the Uyghurs. That's a perfect example where you need to emphasize we're not justifying it. We're not saying the government is right to do it. We just think it's useful to understand what the perceptions they have that led them to do this are. And so I think one thing you do is you just have to keep saying that. I mean, there may be a better technique, but I increasingly try to say in advance, I'm not defending this, blah, blah. I just want to say, if I forget to do that and somebody says, oh, you're defending them, you just try to clarify, all I want to do is have a clear understanding of why something bad happened. Okay. I think that's always in principle a good thing, to have a better understanding of why bad things happen. And, I don't have a better solution than that.
Wasn't there a part two? I thought you said there were two things. Did I miss the second?
I just meant you can do it preemptively or after the fact. You can say, before you even go on your spiel, you can clarify your aims, or you can wait until they accuse you of being an apologist. Or usually you have to do both, because the spiel doesn't get you off the hook. You do the preemptive thing, and then you have to tell them again.
Probably lace it throughout.
Yeah. And again, one thing people do is, I'm bad at this because I just don't like to emote. There's something that's in my nature. I'm just not wild about spending a lot of time lamenting things that I do think are bad. Especially when I feel like I'm like catering to someone or something, I'm just not. So I'm not the best person.
There's something about relation to motive and catering.
Well, I think I know what you mean. I'm saying I'm especially averse to emoting when I think the emoting is catering to someone's demands. Like I do feel horrible about the Uyghurs. But if I know that you are kind of demanding that I say that, I'm less inclined to say it, if that makes sense. Because it just feels like, yeah, whatever. That's just, so I don't, yeah.
I had a thought that I'm trying to recapture. Where do you think you'd want to go next?
Well, I do think I want to, at some point get to this, there's a commenter on the newsletter. It's the Nonzero newsletter.
That's what it was. But, the kind of exercise you just described, being able to get into that discussion around explaining and reiterating that you're just trying to explain and understand. How is that? This is the thing. You're counseling ways to be kind of better, more mindful on social media, but I just don't know how that dialogue would ever transpire in that context.
Well, you could say those things in that context. I mean, the invention of the Twitter thread. I don't know if it was always technically possible, but it was only a few years ago that people started using threads to really do long flowing arguments on Twitter.
Oh, right.
It does, even Twitter does, and Facebook, you can do much longer posts to begin with, but it gives you the space to clarify your intentions and preemptively dispel the idea that you're excusing people when you're not. It's not impossible, but I think that the question this guy, this commenter whose name is Mutter Fodder, I doubt. Oh, I get it. It's MUTTERFODDER. I suppose that's like mother, father. There was or
just say it. I think it's something else. If you say it 10 times fast.
I'm missing that. Should we take this offline?
Yeah, maybe we can take it offline.
I don't know. There was before you were born, there was a comic song by Alan Sherman that started off, "Hello, Mutter. Hello, Fodder. Here I am at Camp Granada." Well, anyway.
You say you can't sing?
Yeah, right. You wouldn't know it, would you?
You would not know that.
Hey, by the way, somebody told me that you who knew you in, I don't want to use the term prep school, but knew you in your prep school, said you were a great jazz musician.
That was Yeah, I was able to kind of convince people of that at one point.
It was funny. It so happened that in my inbox at one point, your name and his name were like, your emails were right next to each other. And his was an email telling me that he knew you.
That's funny. I have a feeling I think I know who it is. Did you once work with him at the New Republic? Or
that is true. That is true. I mean, I don't think we were there at the same time, but yes, he worked at the New Republic. Where were we? Anyway.
Well,
Mutter fodder. Let me get this, because I keep promising this. So he was responding to a piece where I did a deep dive into this exchange on Twitter involving Michael McFaul, who, for reasons I still don't understand, was ambassador to Russia under President Obama. He's just really not cut out to be a diplomat. He is so bad at cognitive empathy. Sorry, folks. Hate to go off on this guy, but I just don't get it. And he got into what I thought was a needlessly antagonistic exchange with a Chinese journalist who, granted, is himself a little bit of a flamethrower on Twitter. But anyway, I was kind of chastising McFaul, and Mutter Fodder wrote, Bob, you see the boxing ring that is social media, yet I gather you still believe that forum is salvageable when its dynamics inherently promote antagonism rather than rapport. I think I had said in the piece how common it is that McFaul gets positive feedback for, facing off against this guy. And, so that's, I think, what he has in mind when he writes that. Then he writes, I know on the Dharma of Bob podcast, that's us, you hinted that maybe the tide could be turned by courageously expressing cognitive empathy there, meaning on social media. But what's the actual plan? Now, I took that to mean, is this scalable? Obviously, I think it's clear how I thought cognitive empathy could have been deployed in this case. McFaul had not tried hard to understand. He should have seen the Chinese journalist was misunderstanding him. It shouldn't have been hard for him to surmise what the probable nature of the misunderstanding was, and to just clarify what he meant in a way that would have diffused the antagonism. But instead, he just goes off. So I think Mutter Fodder knows that I have a plan by which, Michael McFaul could, if he wanted to, use more cognitive empathy, and any one person could. So I think the question must be like, okay, but how do we get enough people to do this for it to make a difference? I don't know. Maybe you read it differently, but that was what I think.
So when you say how to get this to scale, how do you get cognitive empathy to be a practice?
Yeah, and again, it's maybe to some extent the question is how do you get it to be considered cool? Like how do you get using the term apologist to be considered uncool, and how do you consider these are related? Right. And this gets to something we were saying before we started taping, which is that you are a little more in some sense, more in the pedagogy business than I am. Now, I am in the expository writing business. The business of explaining things through writing, but you are more in the, pedagogy in the sense of motivation, maybe business. Would you say that? What did you mean? You, by virtue of being a yoga teacher, meditation teacher, you were saying there's something you do that I don't do. In that space, I'm a trainer. I teach teachers and how to teach some of these practices. So and it's all self-developed. I mean, I'm coming up with my own curriculum in a way and my own, talking points around it. So I'm just thinking about how these things get taught. And so I've been imagining in a way, and I think I said this in an email, I think in some regards, the kind of awareness and mindfulness that you're talking about related to being aware of feelings and the body. This is a kind of a curriculum that's ready to be injected into yoga training in a way, I think. And then that's sort of I could see it as a Trojan horse where
yoga being the Trojan horse, where it's already established as a very popular thing worldwide. And if you make this compelling case, I mean, because yoga practitioners always are sort of interested in trying to see how their personal practice is contributing to a betterment of the world. And that's often kind of, I think, ridiculed by cynical folks or skeptical folks. But there is that interest. And if there was some way of coming up with a kind of, not just for yoga, but just a curriculum, I would think there needs to be some sort of educational piece around how does someone develop the skill sets, both of perception and understanding, so that they are more immune to the pernicious influence of these biases.
You know, this is something I want to throw out just before I forget it. Like, in loving kindness meditation, you think about the spectrum of people ranging from yourself to, like, your worst enemy or something. And you try to wish them well, basically. What if you had people in a meditative state think
actually, can I interrupt that for a second? Because on the surface, that can seem, it doesn't really, I think some people might be confused about why that's a benefit. But I think that exercise relates to the cognitive empathy. There's an undergirding in that exercise that relates to cognitive empathy, which builds on the premise that every person that you're sending the loving kindness to seeks safety, happiness, peace for themselves, even if their strategies for securing those things are problematic for the collective, say.
Right. I think that's true. I mean, I hadn't thought of that, but I think it's true. But what I was thinking was, what if you said explicitly, I don't mean necessarily it's part of loving kindness meditation, but at some point in some meditative instruction, so think of your worst enemy and just try to imagine something they've done that you didn't approve of, and try to imagine why from their point of view it made sense, or what was motivating them. And ask yourself if you've ever been motivated by anything like that. I mean, you know, that kind of, because I do think people will be more successful at this when they're in a state of kind of meditative calm. And in fact, it has happened to me at least once that I remember, just spontaneously on a meditation retreat. I thought about the person who's just about my worst enemy in a very, I wrote about this a little in my book. I did not name the person there and will not name the person here. But but thought about, it was just suddenly so easy to imagine him on the playground as an adolescent being this gangly, like unathletic person. And maybe this is the wrong theory, but like not realizing social status via one common way that adolescent males try to reach it, you know, and ultimately finding a way that he wound up very high status, and it just suddenly made sense. And the way he was that I didn't like was just part of this adaptive mechanism. And we all have this. We all try to find a way to win the esteem of our fellow human beings. We all try to find an arena in which we're thought highly of. He had found one. It involved being an asshole. Sorry, I shouldn't put it that way. It involved doing things that rubbed me the wrong way. I could just see a human developing this way. And it's like, what are you going to do? I mean, yeah, we're born. He was responding to the same imperatives we all respond to in an environment different from the environment I was myself. I had found myself in.
So when you were going through that exercise and that kind of imaginative exploration of this guy's history, you mentioned you were in a meditative state of calm, but I would ask, did you notice any kind of somatic expression of that process? Because because I've gone through this similar thing in meditation, not necessarily trying to explore why the person is wired the way they're wired, but more just being sitting there on the cushion in a retreat hall and being visited by the quote unquote, the enemy or the person you have a really charged problematic situation with, and there's a tremendous flood of physiological sensations that come through. And I think that this is like learning to ride that wave, just to see it come through and to see.
You mean the normal flood of like dislike and antagonism?
Yeah, but I'm talking about the feeling in the body of like the heart rate, the constricted throat. I mean, and that's what's kind of interesting on a retreat or in a meditation session when it occurs, is that you're essentially inured from, if that's the right word, if you're walled off or in a bubble from any actual trigger or stimulus of the situation. So it's all created in your own mind. And yet it can flood through the body with this whole pattern of very difficult sensations, which you might not normally even attend to, because off the cushion, those sensations are going to drive you to all variety of action. But to see that, and this is where one of the things about the meditation I think is relevant to what you're talking about, is that by going through that process, actually sitting through the difficulty of those sensations, you're essentially giving yourself a simulated training to recognize those situations when you're off the cushion. So you develop a wherewithal of being present to them, and also non-reactive in a certain sense.
Yeah.
So when those same impulses come up, you're able to catch them. It's a pattern.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think actually in this case, this is like day 5 of a meditation retreat. I'm not even sure I went through the process of feeling the normal antagonistic feelings toward this guy. I was like I was like a love blob by this time. But there's another kind of relationship between, but I think you're right that's in in real life. Like now, if I'm sitting down on a cushion and I think of this person, the first feelings will be antagonistic. And you're right. Observing them is a skill to develop and a habit to get in. There's one other thing about loving kindness meditation, which is that when we are feeling positively toward people, it is easier, I think, to exercise the cognitive empathy. And it gets back, again, this is in a way a byproduct of attribution error, which says if you, with your friends and allies, you'll have an easier time understanding the forces that made them do bad things. Forces other than just, they're bad people.
Right.
So
it sounds like you would like to see an updated form of loving kindness practice that
I'm not sure, I can imagine a variant of loving kindness practice.
Can we change the name? Can we change the name of it to begin with? Because
we would both be in favor of that, probably.
I think something you and I share, in addition to being meditation enthusiasts, is have you ever skipped the loving kindness meditation on a retreat? Yeah, me too.
It just doesn't work. I mean, maybe it's my fault, but it has not tended to work for me. Whereas again, ironically, just regular meditation. Like, I just recounted a case where just in the course of a meditation retreat, from getting deeper and deeper into mindfulness, I was able to view someone much more sympathetically who I generally consider an enemy. And yet the explicit attempt, to do the loving kindness thing tends not to work, for me. And look, I've talked to Sharon Salzberg about this. She is maybe the person most closely associated in the
She's the reigning matriarch of loving kindness.
She's the reigning matriarch of loving kindness. And she knows, like, it works for some people, it doesn't work for others. She's fine. She's not insecure about it. Well,
we can maybe explore at a later time. I don't know if you want to get into now why I think I have an idea why the desired outcome of loving kindness practice might be more readily achieved in more of an awareness-based practice for someone like you and me. But we can shelve that for a while.
Yeah, we've been talking for I guess well over an hour. Do you want to slide a little into? You had wanted to talk a little about myth.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to say other than, as I said over an email, I was looking at some lectures by Joseph Campbell in a series called Mythos, and in one of the early lectures, he said something to the effect that a myth has four parts. And four functions. There's a cosmological, sociological, pedagogical, and mystical. That's the last I'm saying mythical, but mystical dimension. And his view is that if a society doesn't have an organizing myth, a modernized, updated myth, that it goes into dissolution. Mm-hmm. And he emphasized and underlined the point that if you only have the first three, if you have cosmology, sociology, and pedagogy, you only have those, you don't have a myth. You need the mystical experience of transcendence, or you could say unity consciousness, that ties it together and prevents the first three from just being ideology. And so and I don't fully understand. I haven't really thought through why the first three wouldn't be effective enough on their own. I have sort of rudimentary thoughts to that idea, but I think it's something to explore. It's like, because we haven't really got into this. What if there's other folks that, as I said, that see the experience of transcendence, whether it's through mystical union and in spiritual path work, or through psychedelic work, or through ecstatic, say, dance, or sort of collective ecstatic experiences, that there's something non-trivial and important about that experience to the cohesiveness of a society.
Well, so, I mean, first of all, you're saying, like, you think my worldview, the Dharma of Bob or whatever, when you say it has the cosmology and sociology, pretty much, well, is pretty clear. By cosmology, you mean, and here we'll have to speak just kind of telegraphically, I guess. We can't go into all of these things enough to make them clear.
By cosmology, I just mean you're describing our species in relationship to the story of the cosmos. So you've talked about evolution, and then the logos, and how, the directionality of all of that. The
possibility that evolution is an expression of the logos, and so on. And then by sociology, do you mean partly psychology? Like, does that include the diagnosis and the prescription part, or what?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. The diagnosis of where this can go wrong, or how this is going wrong.
So that's the diagnostic and prescriptive part of the Apocalypse Aversion Project, kind of.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And so then the things you think are less fleshed out. I mean, look, first of all, you're the one saying that I should try to reach mythic status, I guess, and flesh out the four cornerstones.
Well, I mean, just because of the urgency through which you are.
Yeah, I do claim to think it's. Yes, I do think it's important.
I agree, and I agree with you. I mean, I would say the reason I teach meditation is because I believe in the power of the practice to transform consciousness. Mm-hmm. Not that I'm like a shining example of it, but I have had enough taste of it to know that it does deliver a very different shift or change in how you see yourself in the world.
So if the other two cornerstones are pedagogy and mysticism, the pedagogy would include the kinds of things we just discussed, like, you could introduce into a meditative practice the exercise of cognitive empathy or something?
That's one way, one avenue. I think I mentioned this in an email to you a while back, the idea of cognitive bias training, period. I mean, if these bias, I can already imagine if it's not happening, I'm surprised it's not happening, but there's got to be a corporate incentive to mitigate the influence of these biases on people's ability to be efficient and productive, for example. So you can make a case that in any field, these biases are going to make you a less optimal agent. And so there could be a whole sort of multi-leveled expression of an educational curriculum around that. Mm-hmm. And so just like you're saying, I think this may be a part of what you're getting at with the book. when you say that these phrases of condemning the apologist, or the use of the term apologist, and getting people thinking more in terms of existential psychological threats, there needs to be an apocalyptic aversion project lexicon, in a way, not to get, and again, which every time I say something like that, I feel like, am I getting Orwellian here? Is this becoming kind of this dark form of social control?
I want to do that. I mean, and I want to, locate it in the newsletter. That's why, by the way, I've been vaguely imagining like this kind of fleshed out thing, like where these various elements I talk about with the apocalypse aversion project, whether it's non-zero sum games played by nations, in other words, problems they can both, nations can achieve win-win or lose-lose outcomes through. There's that. There's psychology of tribalism. And I've had, but I kind of don't know where to start. Like if I'm going to build out some kind of website or something that ultimately does include a whole lexicon and an explanation of the meaning of the terms and so on. And one thing I liked about existential psychological threats is it seemed to me like a region of this where I could start, right? Like, I think there's like 4 or 5 things I'd put under this heading, start explaining their interconnection, and, it could be like so anyway, I agree. I want to build this out. It's challenging. But we don't disagree about wanting to have a lexicon and making it a cohesive thing. I mean, that's.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know much about this, but I'm imagining something like a school of thought, even. Like that there's a, and you wouldn't necessarily need to be alone on that, but you get like-minded allies that agree enough to really generate a kind of school of thought that would have a pedagogy because you see this in other forms, whether it's sort of cultural bias awareness or I'm trying to think of some other examples, but ways that, again, in my world, in the yoga world, being trauma informed is kind of the buzz thing now. And there's, as people are getting more aware of it, people are sort of encouraged to seek education around it, to be a more well-rounded teacher in some sorts.
To be trauma informed, you said?
Right.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think on the point of, finding allies. It's funny. I am trying to explore and find dimensions of connection with different schools. And one thing I've only recently thoroughly appreciated is that, like, for example, these effective altruism people, you've heard of them, right? The people.
Say more. I've heard of the concept.
It's related with Peter Singer. It started out as like, like figuring out if you're going to donate money to charity, where will it do the most good? Where will it get the most bang per buck? How many lives will you save via mosquito nets that are, done by this one NGO versus, nutrition, blah, blah, blah. So it started out as this kind of rigorous, exploration of how you get your altruism can get the most bang per buck, the effective altruism, movement. But I think it has other dimensions. And this 80,000 Hours podcast I was on, and again, the conversation is in the Wright Show feed as well as in their feed, with a guy named Rob Wiblin, who's the host of that podcast. I realized that there's a big part of the EA movement is a concern with existential risk. So like they're interested in threats posed by arms races, bioweapons, climate change, and so on.
I mean, I think that, yeah, right. But the thing that I think is unique about your Dharma, right, is the psychological root it's the psychological pea under the mattress that is kind of leaving everything, getting everything a little bit wobbly.
Yeah, but there, you could talk about this other community that actually has some intersection with the effective altruism community, the so-called rationalists, which are like across the board, and at least some of them are creepy, but because ideologically they cover a lot of ground. But there was an article about this in the New York Times that painted the community in pretty unflattering terms, but not entirely fairly, I think. But they are very concerned with cognitive biases. For example, there's a new book out by Julia Galef, who is I've had her on my podcast talking about the rationalist community, and her book is called The Scout Mindset. She distinguishes between the soldier's mindset, like, that's the enemy, kill them, and the scout's mindset, which is to go out in front of the soldiers and just get a clear lay of the land. Just see things objectively. And, and there is that spirit in that part of that movement. So, I think ultimately, you would like to find synergy with people who agree with you along any major dimension, right? As long as they don't violate your values along any major dimension, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of trying to start to do that, but it's a tall order. There's a lot of other stuff. As you know, one's life compels one to do a number of things. Yes.
Yeah. But I do think for this to have legs, to really get transformation occurring at the level that you want to see it, there needs to be a curriculum of practice. I don't see how else it's going to happen.
No, I agree. And the practice, my own practice includes mindfulness meditation and is in that context. And it makes sense for me to work with that because, for one thing, there are some people who know me mainly through that because they read my most recent book, which was about that. Mm-hmm. I don't really feel I've done a very good job of cultivating that community, honestly. I mean, I don't, I guess I'm not totally, like, I wouldn't be a good meditation teacher, I guess. I'm not like you or something. I don't know, there's something.
Well, no. You don't necessarily.
You don't have to be, I know, but.
You don't have to be the deliverer. You just,
right.
you write the programs.
Right.
Or you help design engineer the programs, really.
Yeah, well, that would be an interesting thing for us to think about.
Yeah. No, I think that's another Dharma Bob episode to come.
So we'll just, we'll build the myth. The myth will include the practice and that will, and then Mutter Fodder will see the answer as there's a groundswell of good intentions and mindful use of social media that envelops the world.
Well, that's another question I have is whether I think I'm sympathetic to Mutter Fodder's question there, whether the medium itself is ever salvageable. And I know other people in your comment threads have sort of said that there's other forms that could, we could design new social media platforms that would mitigate these kinds of problems. And that's fine. But I also think there's something about the attention that is being, a friend of mine has a new book out called The Stars in Our Pockets that's looking at how digital technology has essentially created an inner climate change of consciousness. Uh-huh. Our attention span it's like there's coral reefs of attention capacity that have just been decimated. And I think there is interest and some developments too, like these communities of people really resisting by opting out. And returning to not completely returning to like a Luddite level, but turning away from some of these excesses of the technological landscape that are causing these problems.
Yeah, I don't discourage that. I mean, we all need to.
I think that's more realistic.
I think
that's more realistic. You go with your butt.
Okay, but the butt is. I mean, first of all, we all have to tend to our mental health, and I don't doubt that you can use the state you achieve by kind of dropping out of social media, by doing some good things. At the same time, social media right now is so influential that if nobody tries to improve it, we're probably in bad shape. I mean, it is doing so much right now to just create needless antagonism between groups of people that if all the people with good intentions drop out, that's definitely not going to change it. And, you know, there are different things you can do. You can lobby the big social media companies to change their algorithms. Algorithm transparency is a big hobby horse of mine. They should be legally compelled to make the algorithm public, to allow third-party software companies to build their own interfaces on it, whatever. So there's various ways you can engage with a problem, and I respect people who don't engage at all, but somebody has to engage. There
you are.
It has to be more than one person. That's the other thing. Okay, so this is I think this is, I've enjoyed this, and but a person my age really shouldn't try to talk for more than an hour and 26 minutes at a time without a nap.
Or another sip of coffee.
Or more coffee, and I would have to brew that, so I can't just walk over and get it. So thank you.
I think we'll have to leave till next time the status of your meditation practice, which is fine.
Yeah.
No, don't. Just leave it.
Okay. Oh yeah, we'll leave them on the edge of their seats. This will keep them coming back. This will keep them coming back. Okay. We'll leave that for next time. Same here. So, thanks, and let's do it again soon.
Sounds good.